Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a few moments for everyone to come into the room. All right, I think that we've got a bunch of people who have joined us. Maybe some more will be showing up, but I think that we can get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our topic on fire ecology and the wildland-urban interface. Glad you could join us this evening. And this topic is near and dear to us. So there's actually so much to cover and not enough time. So we'll be going over some of the key fire ecology topics and how they relate to where we live. And so this will be about 45 minutes of both myself and Thomas and I speaking. Oops, okay, there we go. So first I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ariel Cowan and I'm your Regional Fire Specialist. I'm part of Oregon State University Extension's new fire program, which focuses on outreach and education on all things fire with the goal of empowering our communities to reduce fire risk. My service area includes most of the east slope of the Oregon Cascades. And next, I'd like to also introduce my colleague and friend, Thomas Stokely, who is the Extension Forest and Natural Resource Agent for Central Oregon. He is a fantastic resource on forest and wildlife information for all residents of this region. So we'll be hearing from him a little later on in the talk. So diving into our topic, and I just want to say, feel free to use the Q&A box if you have any questions at any point in time. So we'll take breaks part of the way through and see if there's any questions. But anyway, diving into our topic, here is a broad definition of fire ecology, which is fire's relationship to the living and non-living environment. So to get a good understanding of fire ecology in our area, I'm going to go over a bit about fire history, fire's importance to the ecosystem, what this means for the wildland-urban interface, and how fuel treatments can play a role in our current situation. Fuel treatments to reduce fire risk in and around the wildland-urban interface can still be considerate of and even beneficial to wildlife, which Thomas will be talking about. So first I wanted to bring up the classic fire behavior triangle. Maybe some of you have seen this before. But anyway, fire behavior really depends on many factors, but can mostly be boiled down to weather, topography, and fuel. And fuel is any flammable material, including vegetation in the forest or around our neighborhoods. So we can't control topography and we can't control weather, but interestingly, we can learn about fuel in and around our communities, and that is a way that we can influence fire behavior. So speaking about fire behavior, it's good to recognize that we live in a fire environment. Across all the different forest types on the east slope of the Cascades, there is fire. This diagram depicts the historical fire intervals and severity levels that were typical across these elevation and forest type gradients. The interval, or how frequent the fire was, and how severe the fires typically would be, differs by forest type, precipitation, elevation, and other factors. So generally, there are 4 common forest types around Central Oregon. There's ponderosa pine forest, both moist and dry mixed conifer forest, juniper woodlands, and moist and dry site lodgepole, or also called jack pine. And there could be a combination of these tree species in a forest. Aspen are not pictured here, though they have been the focus of restoration efforts in the region. So each of these forest types exhibit different fire behavior when they burn, which is more on the lower part of the diagram. So think of where your house is located or where your favorite hikes are, and look at the fire interval and fire severity that was once typical there. Around Bend, for example, is a transition zone of ponderosa pine forest to juniper woodland and range ecosystems. Around ponderosa pine forests, fire occurred on short intervals, meaning it occurred frequently. Every 5 to 25 years, a part of the forest would burn and burn at low fire severity in the understory. So how do we know this? Well, researchers have studied these forests and were able to look at tree growth from year to year by analyzing tree rings. This is something that I used to study. So researchers take a cut of a dead tree or stump, and they're able to cross-reference tree rings with a database to identify what ring was from what year in history. The cut from the stump would also show evidence of fire scars, which would look like little black line on that tree ring, which is really the char from when that tree had burned. So wherever there was a fire scar, researchers could record what year it occurred. Some of the trees in our area are hundreds of years old, and the stumps are even older. And ponderosa pine trees can live up to around 400 to 500 years old or even older. So the cut stump in these photos show a first fire scar in 1482, which is the time of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Researchers are very thankful for all the historic data that trees provide. So learning the fire history in our area has allowed us to put the puzzle pieces together of what our landscape used to look like and how it has changed since development in this area. Unfortunately, I don't have photos of our forests from 1482, but we do have some cool photos from 1909, which is just 4 years after Bend was incorporated as a city in Oregon. Bend and many other nearby towns started as a logging town, and understandably, fire was seen as not only a threat to the community, but also a threat to the valuable timber. So here and nationwide, a campaign was started to put out all fires, or what we call fire suppression. This was before most people understood how important fire was to forest health and ecosystem health in this region. These figures illustrate the negative impacts of fire suppression and exclusion on forests. Removal of frequent low-intensity fire has altered the structure and tree species composition of these forests, leading to more severe fire when wildfire does occur. When fire played a natural role in these forests, it provided many important factors in the cycles of the living and non-living environment. An understanding of historical fire also provides insight into what characteristics help forests be more fire resilient, which has helped us identify goals for the conditions we seek around our homes. So here is that picture again from 1909 and the same location in 1948 and 1989. So notice how much more tree growth there is without any natural moderating process to remove all that overgrowth. Trees are like multiple straws in the same glass of water. If there's only so much water to go around, the more trees or straws there are, the less water there is for each of them, which in turn ends up stressing out these trees. Unfortunately, when forests are overgrown, it is also easier for them to catch fire, for fire to spread into the canopy of trees and spread from tree to tree. In some cases, this has led to catastrophic fires with acres and acres of tree mortality. So if you remember the historic fire severity levels from that first diagram that I showed, the trees in our area are adapted to mixed to low fire severity. If there is so much forest overgrowth that a fire burns too hot, it could lead to high levels of fire severity, which our forests cannot handle. Another thing to point out is how climate has exacerbated this issue. When drought, uninhibited pathogens and insects, and the effects of historic fire suppression are combined, the stress on trees contributes to trees dying. So if you notice more trees dying, it can be from one or a combination of these factors. But what are the other important benefits of fire as they play a natural role in the ecosystem? Fire itself removes fuels, in turn lessening the intensity of a potential wildfire and making later fires safer to fight. When fire is at its natural severity level and frequency, it contributes to keeping forests healthy by removing weakened and diseased trees and keeping competition down. Fire also helps to release nutrients into the soil. Fire creates an open space for tree seedlings to regenerate and triggers the growth of some native plants. Fire killing some trees is good for creating wildlife habitat, which Thomas will talk more about. And lastly, to bring back low intensity fire, as what is done in carefully planned and staffed prescribed fires, helps to reduce community risk to large catastrophic fires. I mentioned that fire improves forest health, but I also want to point out some of the ways that they do this. Do you have any trees like this in your neighborhood? I recommend the next time that you go for a walk nearby or on your favorite trails to look around at the base of the trees. Does the bark look dark or charred? You might not have noticed it before, but many of these trees still show a little bit of evidence that they were once in a fire years ago. The benefit of these trees experiencing a little bit of fire is that it triggers them to heal over wounds and grow their bark thicker, making them more resilient to future fires. It has also been studied that low severity fire triggers a tree's defense system. Sap or pitch are other terms for resin, which trees produce as defense mechanism for trapping, blocking, and pushing out attacking insects, as you can see in this picture. It's pretty neat. So the right level of fire actually helps to boost a tree's immune system. So all of these reasons, including efforts to reduce our community's risk to wildfire, is why we sometimes see plumes of smoke from prescribed burns in the spring and fall. This is a picture I took recently of the prescribed burn outside of Sisters. I imagine many of you have seen some of the prescribed burns that were happening in the past week. These are times of the year when land managers have carefully and painstakingly planned a prescribed burn. They bring in extra people and engines and choose the right window of weather conditions to treat our neighboring lands. They do their best to pick days when wind will push smoke out and away from our communities, but sometimes a little smoke does still get in. This is a trade-off. As much as all smoke is awful, I'll take the lower levels of smoke from a prescribed fire during a time of the year when I can close all the windows in my house, instead of the horrendous levels of smoke from an unpredicted wildfire during the summer. The Forest Service, BLM, Benton Parks, the Nature Conservancy, and other agencies and organizations are all working to restore forest conditions and use prescribed fire carefully to reduce our wildfire risk. Oh, and I just also want to point out, if you would like more information about air quality or when prescribed fires are coming up, you can go to centraloregonfire.org. So you may have also heard of the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, or DCFP. They are another example of an active group in our area that is dedicated to restoring forests, making them more resilient to fire, insects, and disease, and climate change. At the same time, they are creating and improving wildlife habitat, space for trees to grow and thrive, and working toward improving the safety and health of our communities. Some of the most beloved places in the Deschutes National Forest are restoration priorities for the DCFP. Their West Bend project is an example of this, and you can learn more about it on their website. So we know there are agencies and organizations who are trying to reduce wildfire risk and improve forest health. But what can the rest of us do if we live in the wildland-urban interface? First, I want to explain the term wildland-urban interface, or I'll refer to it as WUI. All of Central Oregon, including the neighborhoods of Bend, have been built within a fire environment. You may have heard of the term WUI being referred to as a specific zone on a map where forests meet developed areas. But really, the WUI is not a geographic location. The WUI is a set of conditions where nearby vegetation or flammable material can ignite a home. By that definition, everywhere in this photo is in the WUI. We are so fortunate to live in a beautiful place, and it's not surprising why it's desirable to live not too far from the great outdoors. But many who live here might not even know they live in the WUI and are at risk. Here's a range of examples of the wildland-urban interface, or WUI. The images on the left might be what first come to mind when hearing the term WUI. Elements of human development intermixed with or within or next to the forest create the most dangerous conditions for both residents and fire responders. But suburban and urban areas that are in a fire environment like here are also in the WUI. This is where your landscaping trees, plants, and flammable construction materials can spread fire to homes and other buildings. So I briefly want to talk about how WUI disasters happen so that we can identify how to prevent them. Usually severe fire conditions set the stage. Say there's a high wind event or an 80-degree day and it's very dry out, or any combination. If a fire starts, whether it be natural or human caused, and if it's burning at high intensity or rapid spread, and it's within or near developed areas, it could lead to the next phase of homes catching fire. If there are multiple fires occurring, resources can become easily overwhelmed. Here around Central Oregon, we have 13 different fire districts, but some of them have to drive up to an hour or even more to respond to an incident. If those mutual aid partners and fire responders are overwhelmed, fighting multiple fires, then unfortunately, there can be a period of time of reduced or no fire protection in which many homes ignite. At this point, it can become a WUI disaster where multiple homes are destroyed, like what we saw last year during the Labor Day fires. I know this sounds intense, but the good news is we can use our knowledge of fire ecology, fire history, and how fires spread to reduce the chances of this occurring. We can't control the weather, but we can work around our homes in the WUI, and we can work to stop multiple simultaneous home ignitions. So this is where we should focus our effort. So being that we live in the WUI, it's good to understand what you can do to reduce this risk. Recognizing that there are different types of fuels around you will help you identify maintenance and landscaping goals around your home. Fuels in this photo are anything from the dry and dead grass, the dead and alive needles on the tree or on the ground, the shrubs in the background, the trees, the tree branches and tree trunk, and the stump also in the background. So these are all different types of fuel, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. This next photo might look more familiar. Does your backyard or nearby park look like this? The native bitterbrush is a fuel and juniper is too, but that doesn't mean that we have to remove all of them. But you will want to manage for overgrowth, especially with fuels like juniper bitterbrush, and conifers because they contain very flammable oils. Our homes and landscaping, as good as they look, are fuel too. But there are ways that you can still have a nice looking landscaping and protect your home from fire. Boone Zimmerle's talk on the home ignition zone and Amy Jo Detweiler's talk on fire resistant plants are both being recorded tonight. So I recommend checking both of those talks out once the recordings are posted. Here's a very informational table on the different types of fuel and how they respond to their environment. Grass, pine needles, and small branches are small or fine fuels and respond the most to their environment. For example, they dry out very quickly as opposed to really large fuels like logs and stumps. The small to medium fuels are actually what we need to watch out for the most because they are so dry and they can dry out very quickly and catch fire very easily, quickly spreading fire around. This includes the pine needles accumulating on your roof or the conifer shrubs with lots of dead branches next to your fence. For all of you who know how to build a good campfire, you'll know that you can't start a campfire with just logs. You need to gather and light kindling in order to get your campfire going. The same holds true for wildfires. They need the small fuels to act as kindling. The really large fuels are not as big of a concern because they take quite a bit more to ignite and quite a bit more for them to respond to changes in the environment. And I should point out that you will also want some of them around to provide some wildlife habitat, which Thomas will talk about. So I mentioned all the different types of fuels to manage, but let's talk about spatial arrangement of fuels. When there are continuous, close together fuels, they can easily spread fire along the ground or the surface. Examples include tall, dry grasses, lots of bitterbrush all next to each other, or evergreen hedges, for example. Ladder fuels are another big one to watch out for. These allow fire to spread from the ground up into the canopies of the trees. Examples of ladder fuels would be shrubs or tall grass growing beneath trees, or really low hanging branches. This leads into how the spatial arrangement of fuels can ignite homes and buildings. Fire following ladder fuels up into the canopy of trees can rain embers that can ignite your roof or the needles accumulating on your roof. Whereas continuous fuels can spread direct flames to your deck, fences, or directly to your home. I often see those evergreen hedges planted in people's yards that connect to or are right up against their home, which increases the risk of a home igniting. If you take what you've learned about the fuel types and the fuel arrangement, you can maintain these fuels around your home. As I said earlier, Boone's talk will go over this quite a bit more since he's talking about this concept of the home ignition zone, with a zone from 0 to 5 feet, 5 to 30 feet, and then 30 out to 100 feet. But the main point that I want you to take away from me bringing it up right now is that you can remove ladder fuels in the intermediate zone, which is 5 to 30 feet, by pruning trees up to 6 to 10 feet from the ground. And you can also make sure that your vegetation is spaced out horizontally. So think of this like social distancing, but for trees. And clumps of vegetation is still acceptable, just like family pods. Anyway, I want you to check out the other talks about this topic. So that about wraps up my part of the discussion, but I just want to point out that the OSU Extension Fire Program has been putting out this fantastic webinar series called Fire Aware, Fire Prepared. And it's on Wednesdays at noon, not every Wednesday, but As you can see, we've already gone through a number of these webinars, and you can either register for any of the rest of the webinars, or you can visit our website because these previous webinars have been recorded and you can now watch them on YouTube. And I'd also like to point out that we are going to be providing a more locally based Central Oregon Wildfire Home Protection Strategy workshop. And you can follow this link if you'd like to sign up for it, and it'll be a bit more interactive. So I'm now going to pause to see if there are any questions, and then we'll get to talk more about fire ecology and wildlife with Thomas Stokely. Thomas, were there any questions in the chat?
Currently, I don't see any posted, except for one asking about what WUI was again. If you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat box and we can get to that. Otherwise, you know, as I talk, go ahead and type one in and we can save it for the end.
Yeah, type them into the Q&A box.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. Q&A box.
That's all good. But yes, the wildland urban interface is what the WUI is. And yeah, if there are any more specific questions about that, then I'm happy to answer. All right, well, take it away, Tom.
Do you see my presentation, Ari?
Yes, I can. It's up to what can you do in your community.
Apologies. Don't want to give you the whole thing. Okay, so thank you, Ariel, for that great presentation about wildland urban interface and how fire ecology might interact with our community here in Central Oregon. So, you know, as Ari mentioned, people really move here to get close to nature, but that not only has an influence on the way that fire interacts with the landscape in our community and our infrastructures, but also how our infrastructures influence wildlife on the boundaries and also within our community. So I'm going to start this conversation off with just talking briefly about fire ecology and wildlife and how different species have sort of adapted to this fire environment, as Ari called it. I'm going to talk about how we can reduce hazardous fuels with wildlife in mind so that we can, you know, achieve multiple objectives of both restoring the forest, promoting sort of a safe space between the wildland and the urban environments, but also with a focus on conserving wildlife species that are at risk in this area. And I'll briefly talk about what things we can do in our communities to sort of conserve wildlife and ensure that this, you know, growing community doesn't really negatively affect certain wildlife like mule deer, for instance, that I'll get into a little bit throughout the talk. So what are some major concerns about wildlife in this area currently? Well, the big one would be the historical loss of old, large trees and deadwood. So, you know, historical logging practices would remove a lot of those old fire-resistant trees, replacing them with younger trees. And with the suppression of fire, that density of young trees ends up resulting in sort of a uniform density of trees that doesn't really provide as much variety in wildlife habitat as would our forests historically when they'd be more patchily distributed because of fire. So, you know, this includes sort of habitat loss in some cases, but also, you know, when it comes to the loss of old trees, but also fragmentation. And, you know, you can think of road systems as sort of being a barrier for wildlife movement, the Highway 97 corridor being a major sort of blocking point for migrating species like mule deer. And, you know, with, as Ari pointed out, the density of our forest really increases the risk of uncharacteristically severe fires. And we're seeing this throughout the Pacific Northwest. Washington had experienced some pretty severe fires on the east slopes of their Cascades. And we've had, fairly large fires, including some up, north of town, some right on the edge of town, even recently. Of course, recently it was, more of a brush fire, but the point being that whenever those forests aren't allowed to naturally burn, it might result in uncharacteristically severe fires, which could remove habitat rather than creating it. Um, Here in Central Oregon and throughout the West, mule deer are actually an indicator species of forest health and wildlife habitat, throughout this area. And many folks think, well, there's a lot of mule deer in town. We see them in our yards all the time, so they must be doing just fine. It's quite the opposite, actually. Mule deer populations have been on the decline since the 90s. And it's sort of one of these really complicated set of issues. It's not just one thing like the forest that's influencing mule deer. It's also their winter range down here in lower elevations, habitat fragmentation, like mentioned, the I-97 corridor or Highway 97 corridor, and human infrastructure that sort of fragments their movement throughout the forest. So also invasive species are a big one, and that includes both plants and animals. And Ari had talked a lot about fuel continuity and how you want to really break up the fuels. Well, some invasive species like cheatgrass really sort of thrive in this fire environment and end up reducing the overall diversity of understory vegetation and increase fire spread. So invasive species can not only have a negative effect on wildlife, but also on our communities when it comes to fire risk. And I have to have to add some mention to invasive animals as well, having some sort of uh, either competition when it comes to herbivory, or in the case of our beloved uh, pets, sometimes, like for instance, feral cats can be quite detrimental to bird populations, for instance. So these are just some of the things that we're concerned about as wildlife biologists throughout the area. So due to the fire's effect on the forest, creating a wide variety of different sort of structures within the forest, whether it be these openings or these tall fire resistant trees, dense patches of vegetation in some cases. Um, the variety of different habitat types really sort of promotes a wide variety of wildlife species as well. And so whenever I talk about wildlife, what do I mean? You might, be a fan of wildlife and it seems sort of vague. Well, wildlife aren't just the fuzzy creatures that we, want to watch on YouTube do funny things, but also, some of the slithery ones like snakes and some of the slimy ones like frogs, and also insects. And in general, as ecologists, we consider really wildlife any non-domestic creature. For this talk, I'll be mostly talking about vertebrate animals in this case, but I want to really mention that the importance of insects and fungi and a variety of other creatures that are out there in the forest. So, as Ari mentioned, the forests in this area would have been a lot more open in some cases, where you have these large overstory ponderosa pines, but it also contains sort of, dense patches of vegetation that are regenerating post-fire, and some, thinned out areas where you have sort of a variety of different structures. And you might think, well, when a wildfire comes through, it would just be harmful to the animals. In many cases, a lot of these species can either that are highly mobile can fly away, and some others, like rodents, reptiles, and amphibians, will actually burrow into the soil where the heat can't get to them. The soil is quite buffered from heat. Ariel had actually studied this in her master's, and the heat really dissipates the further you get down into the soil. So that soil is a refuge for wildlife during wildfire events. Never forget being up at the Cascade Crest and finding a tree frog, a Pacific chorus frog, in a burnt stump, just hanging out in a burnt stump, right, less than a year after the fire, which kind of goes to show that wildlife can be quite resilient and, have evolved with this disturbance of fire. And post fire, you get a lot of species that would fill in those openings, like deer, are actually one of those species that I'm going to get my laser pointer here. Deer are one of those species that really thrives, and a lot of songbirds, migratory songbirds as well, really thrive in these openings because of the release of understory shrubs, forbs, and grasses, things they can eat, things they can forage on, and even songbirds will nest in these areas and eat the insects that are feeding off of the broadleaf shrubs and forbs. And so, not only do many species actually thrive in these sort of conditions that are adapted to fire, but a lot of wildlife species are actually quite beneficial to the forest when it comes to forest health and tree regeneration. So how might that be? Well, that rodent that I mentioned that would burrow down into the soil to escape the fire, those extensive burrowing networks actually increase water infiltration into the soil, and also their food caches that they bury will end up being seed sources for a generation after the fire. Once the vegetation starts to reestablish itself, large herbivores like deer and elk provide a fairly substantial role in removing vegetation because they're just these huge animals that require so much food to survive. And so by removing that, they actually end up, in some cases, reducing fuel loading by eating some of the regenerating shrubs and trees and keeping that vegetation low rather than very dense. In terms of like flowering plants, black bear and different songbirds will help disperse seeds throughout these burned areas, increasing the abundance and diversity of berry producing plants, which can be a benefit to a wide variety of different species in the forest. And then once those flowering plants are established, pollinators are really critical when it comes to increasing fruit set of those shrubs and also maintaining genetic diversity of understory species. So helping pollen flow throughout the landscape to increase sort of the resilience of these plants in the face of changing environments. And I have to mention this really cool species, the flying squirrel, and how critical it is in dispersing fungi. So truffles are actually dependent on flying squirrels to disperse because they don't have an above ground fruiting body. The flying squirrel will burrow down and find the truffles, consume them, fly away, crawl away, fly from tree to tree, and disperse the spores throughout the forest. And I have to note how important and how critical fungi are to the health of our forest. Many of these fungi form mutualistic relationships with the trees, helping to extract resources from the soil that the trees would otherwise not be able to get to. So fungi are very critical, and I consider them wildlife as well. And you'll have to ask Ari more about fungi if you're interested, because again, with her master's, she looked at the role of the interactions between fire and fungi when it comes to trees. So that's, feel free at the end to open up some questions about fungi. She's really knowledgeable about that. So, since European settlement and increasing development of our forest lands, as Ariel mentioned, the high density of these forests with the lack of fire has also removed habitat resources for a variety of different wildlife. As you can see in this diagram, you no longer see an opening that's a foraging ground for songbirds and deer and elk. There's, especially in areas that have been logged, where there is no longer those old large trees, there ends up being a lack of sort of coarse wood habitat for these things to nest in, for wildlife to nest in. And then, human influence. We move here to recreate and to play in the forest, but in many cases, those interactions can end up scaring off wildlife and causing stress to them, especially for mule deer that are migrating through the forest and just trying to get to their summer homes up in the high Cascades. And, with this also dense forest, as Ari mentioned, that can lead to insect outbreaks such as the beetle because the competition between the trees ends up stressing the trees. There's not as much moisture available, and that can really result in a beetle outbreak where those beetles are taking advantage of those stressed trees that cannot defend themselves. And of course, uh, inappropriate use of fire out in the forest poses a risk when it comes to the amount of people out in the woods and having campfires, or having fires in areas where they shouldn't, and having that be possible sources of ignition. So, don't want to talk all gloom and doom, but when it comes to our forest, there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid to the way we're interacting with it, including how we better manage it to support wildlife and the natural functions of the landscape. And these fire, as Ari mentioned, is a very natural part of this landscape. And so too are these insects as well, whether it be the pine butterfly, the mountain pine beetle, or the Pandora moth. Those are all native species and they're very natural, but the way that the forests have changed through the century with fire suppression has made them more susceptible to insect outbreaks. And that can also have negative effects for wildlife. For some species, however, like the blackback woodpecker, which is a sensitive species in this area, these fires and insects can actually be great for something like the blackback woodpecker. But when we think about the landscape, we don't necessarily want to see as a society all of our forests burn, and we don't want to see them all turn into sort of this gray pine beetle infected area. There's got to be some sort of middle ground when it comes to how we manage it for the safety of our communities and for forest health. So one big way that forest managers attempt to increase the health of individual trees and promote their resilience in the face of these disturbances to do some sort of thinning operation. And you can see this photo on the left. It's very dense pine stand. You've got this large legacy tree that's, could be upwards of 350 years old. And then this large dead log, which, are great for wildlife. However, if a fire moved through there, it would certainly burn up a lot of that. So we don't necessarily want this condition over here. But when it comes to our thinning operations, and that could be a mechanical removal of trees that you'll often see over in West Bend if you're recreating out there, and you'll see maybe marked trees that are set to be harvested at some point. That mechanical treatment can help to reduce the density of the trees without the fire going up into the canopy. And then following up with a prescribed burning can help to reduce those understory fuel loading, like a lot of this logging slash that could be a continuous fuel that would help fire spread more rapidly through the stand. So prescribed fire is often a really critical tool, especially considering without it, a lot of the understory will just rapidly regenerate and end up becoming fuels in the future. However, we don't want to really forget about these elements, like this large dead log over here, or some of the older legacy trees that are the backbone of our ponderosa pine forests. So, as Ari mentioned, we can sort of reconstruct what forests used to look like when it comes to how patchy they are, with some openings, maybe some patches of dense vegetation, shrubs, and a variety of different age classes of trees. And with fire suppression, it has resulted in denser fuel loading and fire risk, especially surrounding the wildland urban interface. But in our attempt to reduce this fuel, we need to be careful not to just further homogenize or reduce the diversity of our forests in an attempt to protect our communities. So what do? We can't really go back in time. We don't want to have this condition that's at risk of completely burning down, but we also don't want an area that is just this open pine forest with very little diversity in it. So as as forest managers, we oftentimes think of the different resources we can focus on broadly when it comes to these treatments. So what are the things that we can conserve that would be to the benefit of a variety of wildlife species? And here, it's oftentimes sensitive species, endangered species, but more and more we're thinking about how we can increase the diversity of wildlife out in the forest. This includes openings, areas where you have understory vegetation and shrubs. And I apologize, this photo, was only taken a week ago and everything's still pretty brown and not yet leafed out. But these openings, as I mentioned, can be great in providing understory vegetation for nesting for certain songbirds, forage for deer and elk and insects. And, that also means we don't need to just completely harvest everything, but leaving patches of dense vegetation can be quite beneficial as hiding cover, as cover from the cold and from the heat. And importantly, focusing on some of these flowering shrubs that I mentioned that provide fruit mass for animals, provide pollen resources for hummingbirds, butterflies. These shrubs are very critical for a wide variety of species. And legacies are these old, decadent trees that only time could produce. And it's really important to retain them. We don't, when it comes to fuels treatments, we want to focus on those smaller diameter trees. And we want to make sure that we're conserving some of those trees that don't look all that great. We might have like a gnarled top or a big hole in the middle that would be great owl nesting habitat. So we want to make sure that we're retaining these legacies. And we want to make sure that there's inputs of dead wood. So this, standing dead wood is considered a snag, and that can be foraging areas for woodpeckers. Once those woodpeckers excavate a hole, they can, some of the species will nest in the hole, and after they're done with it, you have other secondary nesters like bluebirds or swallows that will come in and move and use those snags as sort of nesting habitats. And of course, once those standing dead trees fall over, they become logs, and then to the benefit of a variety of other wildlife that will hide underneath them or forage on the insects that are within inside of them, or hibernate underneath them. And when we don't have large logs, we can actually create this or emulate some sort of structure that would provide that denning and nesting habitat for wildlife, like these piles. So you might see out in the Deschutes National Forest, oftentimes they pile the logging slash. So all the materials that are left over after the harvest, they'll pile that and burn it. But more and more, we're realizing that we need to be deliberately creating piles that would then, serve as cover for a variety of different critters. And I have to note, when it comes to these piles, we want to make sure that they're not serving as a ladder fuel into the overstory, as Ari mentioned, and ensure that they can actually stick around as well, and that when we do prescribe burns, they don't just get burned up. So this is a diagram from a publication that my predecessor, Nicole Strong, had helped come up with called Wildlife Friendly Fuels Reductions. And so here you kind of get an idea of what it means to reduce fuel loading while maintaining some of those habitat elements. And the key here is breaking up the continuity in fuels, not to remove the habitat, not to remove some of these things that we might think are highly combustible, but to break up the continuity so the fire doesn't spread through the forest so rapidly and so hot. So that means retaining these snags, as I mentioned. Openings are great. Dense patches of vegetation like shrubs and dense trees, are natural part of the landscape. It's not like these forests were completely open. You would have some quite a bit of variability, and logs, and also creating those piles. So deer will forage on those shrubs and the openings, but also require this dense vegetation for times that they're trying to escape and hide from predators, at times where it's maybe too hot or too cold. That sort of buffers them from the ambient temperatures and winds. And a lot of songbirds really rely on shrub vegetation. Hummingbirds will forage on the nectar, and then some songbirds or edge species might live towards the edge of an opening and forage sort of along the periphery of these openings. And throughout the area, providing some of this coarse wood can benefit, amphibians, reptiles, rodents, rabbits. And where you place these wood structures really matters. And in general, we sort of need them everywhere. We need them in the openings, we need them in the dense forests, etc. So, um, and as I mentioned, these snags end up being very critical for wildlife, and in fact, are missing from the landscape in many areas. And so there's a real need to conserve and create snags by topping trees in order to promote, cavity nesting songbirds or woodpeckers that are foraging on these dead trees, and even species like bats that are actually no, regardless of how scary they are, they're actually quite beneficial through eating a lot of the insects that we get creeped out by. And of course, even some of these sensitive species, like the spotted owl, historically been would have taken advantage of some of these, sort of mature forest areas that also have openings where they can forage in. So it's not only just the availability of the habitat, but also whether or not wildlife can move through a given area. So in more natural wildland area, there's plenty of opportunity, in some cases, at least for some species, to move freely through the forest. And as the human influence goes out into the forest, that can oftentimes break up the connectivity of their habitat, so their ability to move from patch to patch. And you know, as as we all know, Bend is a very urbanizing area. We're becoming more urban. Development is increasingly influential on that wildland urban interface. So, how do we actually go about conserving wildlife in this area where there's a really big demand to move out into the woods and to recreate? So, I really like this picture because this prescribed burn has been done. It was done up and out by sisters, and that was deliberately done to help protect that community by reducing fuel surrounding that community. And of course, a lot of the objectives of prescribed burning, as I mentioned, are to benefit wildlife species to sort of restore that historical condition. And um, the crux of the issue is that all this work is being done to restore this historical condition, but more and more people are moving here, adding more pressure onto the habitat. So that not only comes in the form of development, but as I mentioned earlier, the fragmentation of habitat and movement of animals. And it's not only the risk of mule deer getting hit on the road, but also some of our trails when it comes to very heavily used trail systems as migrating mule deer go from their winter range down here in Bend up to their summer range up in the high Cascades. Humans can end up disturbing those wildlife and increasing the stress on them, which can really be detrimental to their overall health and reproduction and their fitness. So, what are things that we can do as a community to help efforts to conserve wildlife? Like I mentioned, there's a lot being done on the national forests and some of our green areas. But what are the things that we can do in the community of Bend to help protect wildlife? Well, native vegetation is one big thing. And there was a recent study, I think, that was done looking at native vegetation versus non-native landscaping vegetation. And native vegetation can have quite a benefit to songbirds, and planting, flowering native plants can be, and maybe even sometimes non-native can be quite beneficial to pollinators, which all of us are certainly starting to recognize their uh, critical role they play in our environment. But you really want to focus on spacing and the species. You don't necessarily want to be attracting wildlife like deer into an area where they might be hit on the road. So we have to be very careful when it comes to the placement of some of this vegetation in a way that it won't harm the animal. And also we have to be very careful when it comes to the continuity of fuels. This is certainly not something we necessarily want, when it comes to having our house right next to this because of the continuity and fuel, as already mentioned, and its spread. So large logs for cover, as I mentioned, these retaining these in our common spaces can be really beneficial for areas because if something requires that cover, they can move from log to log. So making sure they're distributed. If you don't have snags, which oftentimes in the communities are really dangerous for, when it comes to falling on our buildings. So we don't necessarily want to keep them around. But in lieu of standing dead snags, we can actually build bird boxes. But take in mind that, depends on the species you want to attract. This one is actually a duck box, something you might put down closer if you live next to the Deschutes River. And, something smaller will be more of like something for house wren or for bluebirds. But keep in mind that we want to ensure that we're not, like I mentioned, not attracting the wildlife to the point where maybe a cat comes along or some predator comes along and consumes the young in these nest boxes. We got to be really careful we're not attracting the wildlife to the point where they're being negatively affected by that. And it's really important, again, to consider wildlife movement. This is a pretty sad picture of a mule deer being caught in a fence. And so a lot of these barriers can sort of reroute the animals to areas where they might be at higher risk to being hit on the road, can increase the amount of stress on them trying to find a way through their migratory routes. And a lot of these species, have been following the same, at least mule deer have been following the same migratory route for generations and generations. So it's not so easy for them to just change their behaviors. For migrating birds, it's really important to minimize artificial light into the sky. So making sure lights are pointed down, and the Audubon Society and Cornell Ornithology Lab has a lot of great tips on minimizing the influence of artificial light on birds. And all, like I mentioned, we want to really make sure we're not attracting wildlife and that in a way that it results in them dying or it negatively affects their health. So mitigating human wildlife conflict. We also don't want to attract deer while they eat our, our garden as well, resulting in some sort of conflict. So mitigating human wildlife conflict is really critical. And not just mitigating human wildlife conflict in our communities, but also out in the forest when we go recreate. It's important to follow road and trail closures because those are typically set up to benefit migrating or overwintering wildlife that are very sensitive to human interactions. So what can we do on our individual properties? Well, I want to make sure that you are following the home ignition zone guidelines for home safety, and already mentioned those different zones and how dense vegetation should be in those different zones. And I encourage you to see Bowen's talk about that. Include native flowering shrubs and forbs in your landscape. Using xeriscaping, even if they're non-native and beneficial to pollinators, that can be quite crucial when it comes to promoting pollinators that can benefit not only us but nature. And as I mentioned, reducing barriers to animal movement, ensuring that you're not creating sort of this area where they can't move through, and objects that can entangle. This is a picture of a hammock stuck on a mule deer's antlers, and it's more common than you think. I'm sure people have seen videos of deer caught in all sorts of things. So making sure that you remove objects that can entangle wildlife from your property, put them in the shed. Just make sure that you're not trapping wildlife. And if you want to put up bird feeders or bird boxes, as I mentioned, you don't want to attract the wildlife where your house cat might end up taking advantage of that. So there's many ways, as I mentioned, checking out the Cornell Bird Ornithology Lab has a lot of great resources on minimizing the influence of pets on birds. And if you got a tree you want to remove from your property, you don't necessarily have to remove the whole thing. You can cut it short, cut it tall enough to where it won't pose a hazard to your house, but so that it'll actually end up being great foraging ground for woodpeckers and provide you with some wildlife viewing opportunities. And in all, avoid rodenticides. As wildlife biologists, we typically suggest trapping rather than rodenticides, because some of those rodents that had eaten some of those anticoagulant rodenticides will then be consumed by, say, birds of prey like hawks and owls, and those animals that consume the rodents can end up dying themselves. And for pollinators, avoid using neonicotinoids. Those can be quite detrimental for pollinators if applied heavily. And I don't necessarily want to end on a dark note or anything, but it is Earth Day. And I really want folks to think about climate change, forests in our community. And it's really more important than ever with the threats of changing climates, our changing forests, that we think about not only how we protect our communities, but how we can help ensure that wildlife will stick around for future generations. So, and in order to do that, really, we need to all come together, think of innovative ways to, like I mentioned earlier, allow for wildlife movement around our community, and also improve forest health so that we're encouraging the diversity of the forest, so that if a fire comes, as Ari mentioned, it won't just burn the whole thing, and it'll potentially be a benefit to wildlife. So, some brief take homes for you. I think might be running a little over time, but we'll have I think decent amount of time for questions. We all live in the wildland urban interface, and we all live in an area that is a fire environment. And fire has been here since before, since before we were able to record what's happening in the trees. So it's important to really realize that we live in this area that's susceptible to fire, and fire is part of the landscape. So working with fire rather than against it can help to protect our communities. It's important to think about breaking up fuel continuity and reducing ladder fuels, especially in our communities, so that those resources, when it comes to wildfires, aren't overwhelmed. And when we talk about fuels reductions, that doesn't mean removing habitat. So it means breaking up the continuity of the fuels. And we can actually do this in concert with wildlife conservation. And in all, minimizing human wildlife conflict when it comes to trying to, we don't want to promote habitat to the point where it draws in animals so that they can be negatively affected by our urban environment. And we can all play our part in minimizing fire risks while protecting wildlife. So feel free to reach out to us for more information. And here are our email addresses up here at the top. And if you want to check out our Forestry and Natural Resources Extension program or our new fire program, here are the links. I'm sure that the recording, it'll be a lot easier to copy and paste them, but some publications on wildlife friendly fuels treatments and etc. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Looks like we might have some, and these questions can be directed towards Ariel or myself. And yeah, thank you, and really appreciate your time, and hope that we got some good information to you. So do we have any questions, Ari?
We have answered a couple of questions earlier, but I don't see any questions. But there's still time if anyone wants to open up the Q&A box and put in any question that just came to mind. We'll be here for a couple moments just to be able to answer some questions. And I'm also posting some links in the chat too, in case you missed the links that were up on the slide. Great, let's check out. We've
got one question from Kurt. Might be a little off topic, but are there bears in Central Oregon? Never heard of any sightings except for Smokey on license plates. So yeah, we don't have as many we only have black bears in the area. Throughout Oregon, there are only black bears, and you won't expect to see them as much around Bend. throughout Oregon, they're very shy of humans. So even if they are there, your chances of seeing one are fairly low. They're less habituated to that wild and urban interface than other areas like Washington and California, where there's a lot of conflict with bears. So there are bear here, but they're not really abundant in this area. You're going to find them a lot more as you get closer to the high Cascades. You'll find them a lot more over on the West Cascades, but they're around. Always be bear aware.
And then we have another question in the chat or in the Q&A box. Once we have disrupted deer migration, do they ever learn where to go?
That's a good question. We're finding that there's a lot of fidelity for migratory routes. So they have been following the same routes for generations and generations. And so that's really the biggest conflict, is they're not so adaptable when it comes to moving out around their traditional routes. And then, if you look at the aerial of Bend, the aerial view of Bend, you can see, as you go north through some of these migratory areas, is, property line to property line and a lot of fences. So it's not just, whether or not they can move around it, but if they can move around those traditional migratory routes. So it's a big issue, and they're actually going to be putting, with the new construction on Highway 97, they're actually going to be putting in some more wildlife crossings, including hopefully an overpass for wildlife. So it's very important that we, as a community, sort of figure out where these areas, as scientists, we need to rely on the scientists to figure out where their migratory routes are. But then as a community, we need to figure out how to allow them to move through.
And Kathy asked another question. As canals are piped, what is going to happen to wildlife? It's a very good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I know that RA and I had gone out to some sites and looked at some areas that are going to end up being canaled, and certainly some trees are going to die around that canal that are no longer getting the water they need. A lot of those trees, like the big ponderosa pine, growing along those canals, aren't natural in terms of, historically it would have been more sagebrush and juniper woodland, and not so suitable for ponderosa pine, but because that water is there, they can thrive. So certainly going to reduce the amount of, trees and shrub vegetation along those canals, which could negatively affect wildlife. I know a lot of them use it, and I do believe there are plans to mitigate the negative effects on wildlife. And you might know a little bit more about that, Ari. I know that you'd looked a little bit into that.
Yeah, so it sounds like who's responsible for actually putting the canals into pipe are going to, I'm trying to remember if it's up to 2 to 5 years after it's gone into pipe, they're going to be going back through and removing trees that have died. But then, yes, this will end up being an impact on habitat that is used by wildlife. But at the same time, if they're being put into pipe, you would not want there to be a whole slew of dead vegetation and dead trees just sitting there along people's properties. So I'm happy to hear that they're actually going to be doing the work about removing whatever dies. But at the same time, this is it's a tough situation. I know that this is a controversial topic. I do believe that they're offering to those landowners, if they want to do something with the wood from the trees that are taken down once it's going into pipe. But that this is going to be a very long process. It's not going to be all one and done, and it's going to take a while for them to be putting the canals into pipe. But it's a very tough issue because we live in the high desert and there's only so much water to go around. And so, yeah, it is a challenging topic for sure. But I do not doubt that wildlife will find where the water is. So,
Yeah, and certainly like that water has been subsidizing their need to move, and so you might expect that some animals will just end up concentrating more around the Deschutes River or Tumalo Creek. Um, so yeah, those natural water bodies are really critical. So making sure that we maintain riparian zone vegetation around the Deschutes River is really important for a variety of wildlife species that need to seek that water, and they need cover when they go to find that water.
right. So we still have a couple moments. If anyone has any last questions, they can put them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we got a few questions, which I appreciate. Yeah, I appreciate that people have been engaged and interested. And yeah, we thank you all for spending this evening with us to learn a bit more about fire around our region and how that relates to fire ecology, how that relates to the wildland-urban interface and wildlife habitat.
Yeah, if there's no more questions, thank you everybody that stuck around, and thank you Ariel for that great talk on fire and the
Thank
wildland
you,
urban.
Thomas. And like Thomas had said, reach out to us if you have any questions later on. I will be posting our email addresses as well. So we can do that right now. Yep, those are in the chat. So feel free to reach out to us.
So there was a question earlier. You already answered it. Okay, great.
I did. Which one were you thinking?
Oh, in the chat box.
Yeah, so it was a question about that area between 7th Mountain and Sun River, kind of along the Deschutes. And I'm not familiar with what the Forest Service's schedule is for treating that zone, but I know they have a lot of acres to treat, and they have been doing quite a bit of work. But when they do reach that area, it would be really great for them to have public support in doing fuel reduction treatments now that you've learned through this talk or through other ways that you've learned about the importance of doing that kind of work. Because I think, there are times when they propose that they're going to do some work that's not too far from town. And there's a lot of concern from people that it's going to ignore wildlife habitat, and they go through a very lengthy process. It's called a NEPA process, and they have to make sure that they're considering wildlife habitat when they're doing treatments to reduce wildfire risk to our community. So they do often have ways that you can reach out to them and learn more about what their schedule is and what their plans are and how they're going to maintain that wildlife habitat or how they're going to reduce fuels throughout this area. So I would recommend reaching out to your local Forest Service office if you want to find out more information. And also to the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, because they do work in collaboration with the Forest Service. For example, on something called the West Bend Project. They might have a better idea of what the schedule is. If they'll be able to treat that area this year, might not be this year, might be a few years from now, not sure. So they would have a better idea.
Well, if there are no more questions or comments, then I guess we can wrap this up and hopefully get to dinner.
Yeah, or if maybe you've enjoyed your dinner while listening to this,
Yeah.
but whatever the case, I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Ari.